with giving you some background about the composer, his birth, where he lived, and so forth. But this composer is a bit of a mystery. And it was troubling me all along, because I read his biography, and I thought, well, that's horseshit. Because this guy he has clearly studied orchestration with the masters for quite a while. And I believe his first orchestration teacher was J.S. Bach. And after that, it's pretty clear that he studied for a long time with W.A. Mozart. And then I wasn't sure about Brahms, maybe Brahms, but certainly Ravel, without question. And Richard Strauss, absolutely, no question. Varese, probably, and I think Aaron Copland. So when I was introducing him at the General Director's Dinner Friday night before we opened, I said these things to him, and he simply, yeah. So when I got finished with that, I said, so I have now figured out that the only way one guy could do that is if he were a vampire. So my question is, how old are you? And he said, 45. I said, knocked off a 0. This guy is the most unique talent I have ever encountered. He is absolutely proficient, not only in adopting the style of another period, but also adopting its purpose. So when you're listening to music and you think he's quoting Bach, he's not quoting Bach. It's all original. Even the Christmas carols are original. Everything is original. You will not hear Silent Night in Silent Night. It's all original music, but you think it's that composer. It begins with a performance in an opera house of a Mozart opera. And I was called out. I was very curious about this opera, and I was being prodded by one of my trustees, Gerard Seelig, who kept saying, this is a wonderful opera, you should look into this opera, you should look, and finally I said, okay. And I sent off to Minnesota Opera that commissioned it and did the premiere in 2011. And I said, and we're not allowed to share recordings. Opera companies can't share recordings with each other because the orchestra owns the rights to the recordings. And they must be kept locked in a cabinet in your own facility. You can show it to someone, but they are even restrictive about to whom you can show it. So, so I can't send it to them, they can't send it to me. But public broadcasting had done a broadcast of Silent Night. Well, now that is open. So they sent me this PBS recording. And I had my music director, my artistic planning director, my chorus master, and we were all going to sit down and watch this on a great big TV that somebody got rid of and gave it to us. So it's huge. It's a mammoth television. And I got a phone call, and I had to take it. So just as the credits were coming up and the Minnesota Opera, I had to leave the room. So I took the phone call. I came back in, and they were watching some Mozart opera. And I'm looking at this, and I'm saying, well, that's not really Mozart, because I know the Mozart operas. And that's not Mozart, but maybe that's Cimarosa or Salieri. It's a direct contemporary of Mozart, but what is it? And why are they watching it? And then some German officer walked on, interrupted the performance, and announced that Germany was at war. I said, okay, it's Silent Night. I said, I wonder what he was using. I wonder what music he was using. Well, as I continued to watch this thing, I became aware that I was hearing storytelling differently than I have ever heard it before from any opera composer. It's a different approach altogether. I've never heard anybody do this. So, well, this is just so new. And about 40 minutes in, the thought leaked into my brain, I wonder if this is what audiences felt when they attended La Scala and saw the world premiere of Nabucco, when they heard an entirely new voice in opera. Until Nabucco, they hadn't heard Verdi. They'd heard Verdi trying to be Donizetti. Same with Puccini. when the first audiences to hear La Boheme, they heard an entirely new voice in opera. Before then, he was just writing in the style of his contemporaries. But when he wrote La Boheme, that was new music, that was original, that was the voice of Puccini. You heard it for the first time. And I was very aware that I was hearing, for the first time, a new voice in opera. And by the time I finished it, I was pretty much dedicated to the idea that we were going to have it here. But that was not really because of the music. The music is astonishing and astounding and spectacular, and it's music for the ages. But the reason I wanted to bring it here is because I presume that you were as ignorant as I am. Because I had never known of this Christmas truce. I did not know. Listen, honey, when it comes to books about war, I had never read one. I never saw Apocalypse Now. I didn't go. Giving me a book about war would make as much sense as handing a Mormon a book of cocktail recipes made with coffee. Just nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me. I was 18 in 1968, and I didn't know anything about the Vietnam War. I was having lunch with 3 guys at school, right? And they were talking about the Gulf of Tonkin, and they were all up in arms. And I was sitting listening to all this. I was amazed. I had no idea, what the hell? What's going on? And they were talking about all this stuff, and then I asked an obviously naive question. And this guy stopped everything dead and he says, "Don't you read the newspapers?" I said, "No." "Don't you watch the news?" "No." "What are you, a Republican or a Democrat?" And then the guy beside him said, "Oh, Larry's not a Republican or a Democrat. He's an aristocrat." That was not meant to be kind. So, but I think that has had a lot of truth. I grew up in the countryside, far away from everything. I was an only child living way out in the woods, right? We had horses and cattle and orange groves. That didn't mix a lot with other people. So I've kind of been a loner always. I practiced the piano and read my books. And then when I went to college, I went to a conservatory, went to a school of music. I didn't even take liberal arts classes except for foreign languages. I took 2 weeks of English. And they told me to get out. So then I was going to take creative writing, and they said it was too late to sign up. So I'm an uneducated person, deeply uneducated. I've been trying to make up for that ever since 1972 when I graduated, and I found out how stupid I was. What was I doing? I was trying to figure out how to play Chopin. I was trying to figure out how to sing Schubert. I was trying to figure out how to phrase Poulenc. I was trying to figure out how to translate Donizetti. My whole growing up, my whole formative years were all about people from other countries, except for Aaron Copland and Sam Barber. I worked on them. But it was certainly nothing to do with borders and nationalities. It never even came into my thinking. It was a different thing. It wasn't about your nation. It was about civilization itself. That was the thing that had my attention. People have often said to me, "Oh, you must love opera." And I think, well, yeah, I do. But no more than I love ballet, no more than I love symphony, no more than I love literature, no more than I love poetry, no more than I love theater. I love all of these things. Architecture is probably my favorite if I had to pick one thing, because it lasts. Of course, we've given that up. We traded in architecture for shelter. So we don't have, I was walking down the street today looking at the houses, and it's hit me again. Walked downtown for breakfast and walked back home, and there are all these things built in the 19th century. And then all this crap that we built in the 20th century, all cheap by jowl. I had a profound experience of that in Paris, walking on the Cour de Paris, and there were structures that were built in the Middle Ages, and then the late Middle Ages, and then in the early Renaissance, and then the Renaissance, and then the flamboyant Renaissance, and there they all were. But many of them had been knocked down and been replaced by things built in the 20th century. And it's just, that was the first time I had that thought. We have traded in architecture for shelter. As cheap as you can make it, and as high a rent as you can possibly charge to live in. How much money can I squeeze out of this? And how much pride do I not have in what I'm leaving behind? And so, frankly, it's been true across a lot of art forms. People have been trying to tell me for 100 years now that beauty has no intrinsic value. Beauty has no intrinsic value. You get it everywhere. You get it in sculpture. You get it in painting. You get it in assemblage. You get it in architecture. You get it everywhere you look. You get it in music. Beauty has no intrinsic value. Well, Kevin Puts does not agree with that. And he has written music that is so violent it rips your liver. And he has also written music so sublime that you don't ever want it to stop. That's funny. So, in capital of Silicon Valley. All right, so anyway, not knowing anything about war, I had to educate myself. So I started reading. I started with Barbara Tuchman's The Proud Tower, which I will read to you from any minute now. And then after that, of course, The Gods of August, her companion to The Proud Tower, and 1916, and To End All Wars. I kind of stopped at that because I was sick to death of it. But I did watch probably 20, 25 hours of documentaries on YouTube. Every battle of World War I has its own documentary. And a whole lot of stuff leading up to it, and a whole lot of stuff past it. And then Fall of Eagles, where I learned something from Lenin that has changed my thinking about the world. This war didn't have to be fought. And you're going to hear something about that at the end of the opera. There's a big soliloquy of Sprink, Nikolaus Sprink, he's one of the principal characters. And he suddenly has a rant about who you're fighting for in this war. And there's little program notes that I scribbled down in the program tonight. I took a little flight of fancy after reading this and realizing what happened as a result of this war. The Ottoman Empire was overthrown because they fought on the German side. The Ottoman Empire ran from the Dardanelles, across the water from Greece, all the way through Egypt. Arabia was a kind of a suzerain. They were owned by, but not necessarily entirely ruled by, the Ottoman Turks. Okay, they had some autonomy, but they were still beholden to the Ottoman Turks. The Persians were independent. That government had been there hundreds and hundreds of years. Persia had been there thousands of years. What would the Middle East look like today if the British had not been able to come in and carve it into all these little principalities with mixed backgrounds so that they were ungovernable? They could never be self-governing. They did that on purpose. Why did the British give a damn? Because of their navy. The British had the biggest navy in the world. The sun never set on Queen Victoria's empire. But guess what country was the most important country? It was not Britain, it was Germany. They were the most highly developed in every way, from industry, military, philosophy, music, literature, painting. They were in the top of civilization. And they had just formed one generation before Germany had finally coalesced into a single nation. And they were jealous of Britain. And they decided to double the size of their fleet. That was Bismarck. Double the size of the fleet. Well, the British fleet decided they needed to change from coal to oil to power their engines. Guess where the oil was? Right where it still is. And the World War I, Lawrence of Arabia, everybody's over there fighting. That was a proxy war. The British were funding the Arabs, the Germans were funding the Turks. And they were fighting over Fallujah. That's what that was about. You can't run a ship on coal. The Titanic went down because it was run by coal. They've only recently discovered this. Coal, when stored in closed bins, big ones, spontaneously combusts. You can't have that on a boat. That's not happy. So they wanted to get rid of coal. They wanted to convert to fuel oil. Well, that was one little thing. And then there was Krups and Braun and Hindenburg developing the most lethal weapons anybody had ever heard of. We developed the machine gun, by the way. We can wear that. Russia they were the Romanovs, right? For centuries, the Romanovs had ruled Russia unjustly. And they were idiots on top of that. And they had to send their army to the Eastern Front to fight Germany, which meant that the people could rise up and kick out the Romanovs. And then they had a little interim government over there. Lenin was in Switzerland. The Germans sent him in a closed rail car to St. Petersburg to topple that fledgling republic. 6 million Jews are killed ultimately because there's just one big war. We should call it World War A and A1, or World War I and 1A, because it was just one big war. 6 million. What would the world look like with those 6 million Jews still in it? What would Germany look like if we hadn't bombed it out of recognition? That's right. What would France have been if they hadn't lost an entire generation of men who then were not there to father the next generation of men, so that when Germany comes walking through the second time, they had only enough men to fight for 2 months, and they were toppled. And we criticize them for it. We make fun of the French. I just can't help but wonder what the world would look like today if that didn't happen. But the worst part of it was how we suddenly got fascinated with turning our industrial strength over to military strength and making bigger weapons, not just little rockets, big rockets, ballistic missiles, now armed with nuclear warheads. Bigger, more lethal. And now, what would America look like if we didn't have to give 57% of our discretionary budget to maintaining the mightiest standing military force in history? What would our rail system look like? What would our universities look like? What would our elementary schools look like? What would our highway systems look like if we weren't doing that? Yeah, okay, maintain an army, but the biggest one in the history of the world to protect ourselves from Canada? This is very free form. I didn't plan this. But I'm going to read you a little thing written by the Crown Prince, who is a character in the opera. His dad wrote a book, and he wrote some of the front matter. So I'll just read from the Proud Tower, Barbara Tuchman. says, for the centenary, a book called Germany in Arms was published with an introduction by the Crown Prince, who wrote, "It is the holy duty of Germany, above all other peoples, to maintain an army and a fleet ever at the highest point of readiness. Only then, supported by our own good sword, can we preserve the place in the sun which is our due, but which is not willingly granted to us. For the sword will remain the decisive factor till the end of the world." I read this last October, and I thought, my God, that could have been written this week. That could have been written this week. So, you're not here for a great big cathartic mess. This is not a sentimental opera. It's just about what it was like. We can't really show you what it was like, because we can't flood the trenches with water. The trenches were dug 5-6 feet deep, and the water table was 4. So they were in water. And when it was raining, sometimes they completely filled up. And the Germans actually ceased fire. So those guys could climb out of the trenches and not drown. It had been fought in a forest. That had been a forest. Those trenches run from the North Sea at Belgium to Switzerland. There's so many thousands of miles that when I read it, I decided it was a misprint, and I'm not going to tell you. It was a ridiculous amount of miles of trenches. The Germans got there first. They were able to claim the higher ground. And it was on top of chalk. You heard of the White Cliffs of Dover? That's the same stuff that's underneath northern France. It's chalk under there. And chalk absorbs the vibration of artillery shelling. So it's very sturdy. And the Germans were able to tunnel back in and make large spaces that their men could be safe and dry during artillery shelling. That's what made the Battle of the Somme possible. The Battle of the Somme, 20 million, not quite, but almost 20 million, 19,500 and some odd British soldiers were killed in one afternoon at the Battle of the Somme. And how did that happen? First of all, the British didn't think that anybody would ever turn a machine gun on them. They introduced machine guns into war. We introduced the Gatling gun, but the British introduced the machine gun into war in the Sudan. Wiped out the whole Sudanese army in a day. Just laid them, finished them. They also used the machine gun in the Boer War in South Africa against the Dutch, but they were Dutch farmers. And there were diamonds at stake, and the largest gold strike ever. So the British were not going to let anybody have that but them. But they never dawned on them that anybody would turn a machine gun on the British. And the firstborn sons of the mightiest houses in England sent their boys over there with polo ponies and sabers. And they rode, sabers glinting in the sun, directly into machine guns. The firstborns of all the great houses of England were killed in a day, in an afternoon. Because a saber can't do much against a machine gun bullet, unless you're Batman. So you see, we can't explain it to you. That forest that was gone, that forest had been filled with rats. They took refuge in those same trenches. And they multiplied like crazy, living off of the corpses, because they couldn't get the bodies out of the trenches to bury them. They lived beside their dead. They slept and ate and fought beside their dead. We will never understand. It's impossible to understand. And they lived there for 4 years. This is just the first Christmas. It's only that far in, just the first Christmas, when hope still bloomed in the hearts of these 18 and 20-year-old kids. But they were finished with war. They were sick to death of war. There were over 100,000 men involved in the Christmas truce. 100,000 men. But it was not uniformly from the North Sea to Switzerland. It was little pockets. Here, there, here, there, here, there. Some places, Neufchâtel, no, there was no truce there. There were places where the fighting was just continual. But other places where there was no action. And in those places, it seems always to have begun the same way. Christmas carols on Christmas Eve. And all sides knew the same Christmas carols. And some German soldier would walk across no man's land with a Christmas tree, because the Crown Prince sent out, I think it was 10,000 Christmas trees to the trenches, complete with candles. And somebody brought a Christmas tree to the French. And from there, they had these little casual truces. They just stopped fighting. And they met in no man's land. All the little truces they'd had before, they'd had lots of them, little truces, during the whole course of it. But there was never any fraternization. They didn't meet each other. They would just not fire. They would have a little agreement. They could yell, "Hey, we got to do la la la." "Okay, we'll give you 20 minutes. And they'd get something fixed that needed to be fixed. But this time, they met in no man's land. And they shared chocolate and Schlibovitz and cognac and champagne and scotch, rations sent from home, special treats from their own side. They showed pictures to each other and tried to share stories despite the language problems. And the next day, in most cases, it continued on Christmas Day. Oh, and they had Mass on Christmas Eve. And the next day, they continued by burying their dead. Because there were Germans who had died in the French line and Frenchmen who had died in the German line, and there were all kinds of bodies lying out in no man's land between. And they collected them and sorted them and buried their dead. And on the afternoon of Christmas Day, they played soccer. And in the epilogue, you will see what happens to them. Because it was determined that they would all be executed until it was discovered that there were 100,000 of them. So then they executed the officers and sent all of the others over the trench wall and let the enemy kill them.
Oh my God.
So that's how this ended up. So in watching this story, you will realize that it begins with a little prologue. You'll see 3 scenes in the prologue. And it begins with a soprano just entering out onto the apron of the stage. And she's waiting for her lover or her husband or somebody to come home from war. And he arrives and they are reunited. And then that dissolves when a military officer walks on stage and reads a letter from Kaiser Wilhelm II informing them that they have been attacked and they are at war. And he walks off. That then dissolves. And now you're in a little Scottish chapel, a little parish church in Scotland. And there's a kid who's painting statues, or at least this one, and the priest is with him, and his brother rushes in and said, finally, we're at war, finally, we're at war, because the Brits entered kind of last. And it's glory, the glory of war. Come on, little brother, sign up with me. And then that dissolves, and you're in the apartment of Lieutenant Audebert and his wife Madeline, and she's pregnant, and she's given him some what for, because he's got his military uniform on, he's leaving to go to war. She says, can't you just tell them that your wife is having her first baby? Surely they will understand. He says, my father is a colonel. General. Well, my father is a general. I have to go to war. I'll be back shortly. They all thought they were going to be back in 2 months. They all thought it was going to be over in no time. They hadn't fought a war since Napoleon. The Franco-Prussian little thing that only did last a short time was kind of it. They thought they were coming right back. Well, they didn't. And then it goes into the 5 men that you've met so far, singing about what they're going to do, why they're going to war. Yes, we're going to do this thing. And then you meet all the troops. And that's when you're going to hear some ugly music, because they're all singing in their own keys. And everybody is singing along, say, in D major, and the German army enters in D flat minor. Try that. You have to rehearse this opera. So, and then it's just full-fledged battle. Those of you who sit upstairs will be spared a little, because it's not nearly so frightening as it is when you're downstairs. And then the battle is over. And then each of the lieutenants, there are 3, Horstmeyer, Lieutenant Horstmeyer, where Niklaus Sprink is serving under Horstmeyer. And then we have Lieutenant Gordon, the Scottish guy, and both of the boys, William and Jonathan, they're serving under him. And then there's Lieutenant Audebert, who you know. And the guy to pay attention to there is called Ponchel. He's his aide de camp, Ponchel. And also you will meet his father, Audebert's father. And lots of other people too. If you're just following their stories through to the end. And in the epilogue is you find out how they are all going to be dispersed, where they're going to go. The Germans are sent to Pomerania to fight the Russians. Everybody was terrified of the Russians because there were so many of them. But the Russians took it hardest. They have more casualties than anybody because they only had half enough weapons. Every other man had a weapon. Everybody else was just standing there. So they died like flies. They just. And then the women came. The Russian women came, pitchforks. We don't know how many were killed in Russia. So you're just going to watch that through. They're going to do all the things I just described. They're going to declare a truce. They're going to share things with each other. They're going to collect their dead. They're going to have mass. And they're going to play soccer. And to me, what this thing is about, that we've had many discussions at the early, 2 years ago when we started working on it. What is it about? What is it about? And we all of us independently came up to the same conclusion. It's not about war. It's not about, is war good, is war bad? That's never addressed. It's not about that. It's about what human beings are under the most grinding circumstances. The most brutal, grinding circumstances. What are human beings? That's what this is about. And some are pushed to greater vengeance. And some are so appalled by it that they actually abandon ship. They desert. So you're going to see a wide range of things. This advocates nothing. It just shows you what happens to people when they're in unbearable circumstances. So, Mark Campbell, the guy who wrote the libretto, has 15 operas to his credit already, and right now, in 2017, will add 5 more world premieres. And Mark and Kevin have teamed up to write a second opera that was already premiered. It's called The Manchurian Candidate, and that was a couple of years ago. And then this September, they're premiering another work called Elizabeth Creed, from the novel The Trial of Elizabeth Creed. I don't know what that's about. I just know it's smaller forces. I'm grateful for that. We might be able to do that. This is too big for us. When I was looking at the thing, I was just determined we were going to do it. And I got the score out and I started counting the characters. Well, of course, you know, if you're dealing with the money, the first thing you're going to try to figure out is what are the forces, right? So I'm counting the characters, and they don't change clothes much, but there are 14 of them, 14 named characters. and one character who's a speaking part, so 15 in total. Well, that's a lot. For us, 14 characters means 28, because you have to have a cover for everybody. So it's double the costumes. But nobody really changes clothes much, so okay, that's kind of doable. So then I looked at the chorus, and it was 3 armies. But I figured out that we could put 10 in each army, because in the first minutes, almost everybody is killed. So 30 down over there, 20 down over, a lot of people get killed. So 10 in each army, okay, so we're doing all right. We have more than 50 men, right? Count that up. There's more than 50 men in this show. If you count the 3 dead ones, there's 53. The dead ones were unnerving, by the way. You go into rehearsal and you think, says, don't step on him. Oh. Dead men laying around. And then I started counting the number of instruments in the orchestra. And when it got past 60, I quit counting. Because the fire marshal tells us plainly, 47. 47, it's posted on the wall. So I'm going, well, okay. There's no way that the composer would sanction a reduction down to 47 players when he's written it for like 68. So forget it. So I wrote everybody nice letters for thank you for sending me this stuff. This is one of the most magnificent things I've ever seen in my life. My God, I wish I could do it. But it's just too big for our orchestra pit. I figured other things we might be able to surmount. We can't surmount that. And I sent it all back. I went to New York to hear some singers. Got an email in the evening. It was this guy named Kevin Putz. And the message was very simple. How many musicians will fit in your pit? I said, well, that's hard. Because if it's a Verdi orchestration, 47. But if it's Carl Orff, about 6. Just depends on what you do with percussion. Well, guess what arrived? An arrangement for 47. He did a reduction for 47 players. And it's, I think, better. Of course, I'm prejudiced. But it's really brilliant. So then I hired a set designer and a stage director. Said, would you like to work on this project? If we do it, it'll be in 2 years. But I can't consider doing it until I know how much the set is going to cost, because it's a crazy set. And they both agreed, and they worked for a long time, and they sent me back the drawings that we could then cost out, and I could figure out how much the uniforms are going to cost, because they have to be accurate military reproduction uniforms, and you have to build those. So that was going to be a lot. Each of the French uniforms takes 10 weeks to make. Each one of them takes 10 weeks to make. Horrifying. And it was too much money for Opera San Jose. So I remember a gal named Carol Buck. Carol Buck funded Anna Karenina. Some of you may have seen Anna Karenina. So she helped us with that. And we've sort of had a chatting acquaintance. We've gone to a concert together. We've gone to dinner together in the time since. And she happens to be in San Jose for some reason. She'll let me know. And we'll do something. I thought, well, you know, she might want to help. So I called her. She took my call. Well, that was good. And as it turns out, I had received news about 2 weeks before that. I have a half-brother who, we were separated when he was 18 months, and so we've never really lived together. But we've always kept in touch and visited each other and spent time together, but he grew up in a different kind of life. But I just got the message that he has leukemia. So I'm calling Miss Buck. This is more than a year ago. I call Miss Buck, and she didn't know about Silent Night, and I'm telling her the story. There's this one place where this Scottish boy is trying to bury his brother who was killed in no man's land. And there's no truce on. He's out there risking his life to bury his brother. And I got to the place where Lieutenant Gordon says, don't shoot him! He's just trying to bury his brother. And I couldn't talk. I was completely shut down. And she says, oh, Larry, for heaven's sake, don't worry about it. I will send you the money. She says she doesn't remember that conversation. So she was here for opening weekend. and she was very proud of our work, and I've kept her abreast. She received all the designs for everything, and she was eagerly looking forward to being here. And she came for the symposium the day before. We had 4 panels. Took all fucking after. Pardon me. There was a lot of effort involved. And then there was the dinner on stage afterwards, so that took a fair amount of effort too. So she was the kind of guest of honor along with the composer and the librettist. And it was a terrific day. And then we opened up, and then I got sick like a dog, which I still am. So anyway, Silent Night, I believe you will find not to be cathartic. You're not going to sit here and weep over what happens. But when it's finished, it should have made an impact on you if we have done our job. You should walk out of here with greater empathy for men who are forced into these conditions. My father lied about his age and joined the war in the Pacific some months before he was 18. And he had 2 brothers who were already in the Pacific. So, and that was all the boys in the family. So Dad was sent after the fighting had moved on from island to island. And his job was to collect the dead. He did that for 2 years. When I saw that photograph, and I said, Dad, what is that? He said, oh, well, those are the Japs and those are the GIs. And instantly you see the Jeep track down the middle. And they were just collecting bodies and then just separating them as they pulled them off of the trailer. I forgave him every bad thing. There's nothing in his life he did that I didn't forgive in that twinkling instant. Our families have lived through this. And they don't talk about it. So, you're going to hear about it from up there. It's not nearly as ugly as the real deal. We couldn't bring water in the theater, and all the rats got loose. I don't know where they are. So, are there questions?
I have a question. Is there a libretto available public anywhere? Library, online, whatever?
No, I do believe that there is no libretto, and there's certainly no recording available, except for the public broadcast recording. So, yes.
What does assemblage mean?
Assemblage. It's a form of art where you gather things that you have normally just found, not created, and you assemble them in interesting ways.
Thank you.
And they're very often gruesome. Baby dolls with the heads cut off, and, stuff like that. Yes?
I just wondered a little bit about what's involved in the music and preparing the music and the singers and all that. And do they learning this opera, will they be able to use it elsewhere?
Well, this opera, first of all, is spending all the time it takes to prepare this thing, which is not easy. Is that wasted time because it'll never happen again? No. This is the 11th fully staged production since 2011. So it's produced more times than any new work that I've ever heard of. And now that there is a small production available, it will go to little companies, because the old production was for the Ordway Theater in St. Paul. Vast stage, huge orchestra pit. So the old version was only available to great big houses. And when I wanted to do it, I knew I was going to have to build new scenery. I went to Kansas City to see that production. It was really clear to me. It's another half the width of our proscenium opening, and much more height than our proscenium would afford. So that's a big set. And building a whole new production means Santa Barbara could do it. Phoenix has already asked me to reserve dates for them. They're planning to bring our production. They were here on opening weekend. Hawaii Opera Theater came on opening weekend. Seattle came on opening weekend. So there's real interest. Those companies have never come here to see one of Opera San Jose's productions. I actually was going to put it in the program. I was told I had to take it back out. So, yes.
You mentioned something about the librettist. I didn't hear you say anything about the composer. Maybe I missed it, but
guy who's the vampire. You missed the whole thing, huh? Kevin Putz is the name of the composer. His bio is in the program. He was born, I think, in St. Louis, brought up somewhere in the northern Midwest. He went to Eastman School of Music. He went to, I think, Yale, and then got his DMA back at Eastman again. So he's the darling. Well, there are three composers that I know about, and I am an uneducated person. So don't think I know. But there are three composers I know about who seem to be the darlings of the symphonic world. And they are Kevin Putz, Paul Moravec, and Mason Bates. So those three guys. And by the way, this summer I will go to hear Mason Bates' first opera, and that will be in Santa Fe. It premieres in July. And that's The Revolution of Steve Jobs. So I'll be going to that to see if that's of it. But these guys are one. And by the way, you should, if you don't have these people's music, shame on you. Go to Amazon and get what you can. I promise you will adore Kevin Putz's Second Symphony. And you will also love his Fourth Symphony. 1 and 2 are not available on Amazon. I don't know how to get them. But there are many other things that he has composed also. Paul Moravec, I'm listening to his violin concerto right now. Every day I listen to it again. It's divine music. They have finally given up on the idea that you can only be ugly as long as you're putting pen to paper. It must be ugly. They have abandoned that because it's boring. It's boring. It has to be boring for the guy that's writing it. So now, you will hear tonight, it goes from the most jarring, brutal, with bombs going off, right? Machine gun fire all over the place. And it will melt into one of the most sublime men's choruses you've ever heard in your life. And there are many moments where he just